One of the most frequent questions I get is how to scale change, how to scale those new product teams you have that are working on your software in more of a product-oriented way that we're always talking about. And I think there's three things that I see people doing that's successful. There's always other methods and more detail, but the three general things are they start small with just an initial set of teams instead of converting everyone in the organization and every team over at once. And part of starting small as always is having a kind of a longer timeline than you would expect to have. They also seed people. So they use people from these initial projects and put them on other projects and on newer ones to help spread that around. And then three, there's frequently a lot of internal training and even branding that these organizations do. So let's go briefly through each of those three things. So first of all is the starting small part. So there's two areas to discuss here. One is that frequently, I don't know if it's frequently, but often we have this idea that if we're changing how our organization functions, that we're changing the way that we're going to think about our software, we'll do it all at once, the big bang approach. And this might work for certain things. I couldn't really tell you what, software upgrades for tools that you might introduce. But when it comes to doing things like rearranging the teams that you have, having teams take that full end-to-end view where they're responsible for the full development and running of the product, your classic DevOps thing, but also your product way of thinking about software, that kind of change all of a sudden across all sorts of teams just is very haphazard and doesn't work very well. And often to do that, you send people to lots of training. You might get them certificates. Classically, this is seen when whether the intentions of things like Scrum and the rational unified process, whether it's this intention, you send everyone to training and then their next project for the next year, they follow things in this new way. Now, I've heard of this kind of working out at some places, but the problems you have with this is it's often too much change all at once for the entire organization. You haven't really built up the trust that it works, that you actually want this change. And you also haven't really figured out how to apply it to your organization as a whole. So anyway, any standard way of operating, whether it's like the Tanzu Labs way of doing things, that kind of product approach, whether it's practices like Scrum, or whatever, you're going to find that as you apply that to your organization, there are ways that you need to tweak it, changes that you need to have. And also you might discover new things that work as well. And in order to do that, as with all sort of stuff in the way that I think software is done well, you want to start small. You want to start with a small group of people, one team, and then maybe two team, and have them figure out this new way of doing things. And then as you have those learnings, you can start to craft and redo what this methodology is that you're following, what tools that you use, what the needs are. You really discover the needs that you have rather than just taking that more waterfall approach to redesigning and redoing your organization and the processes that you use. It's very similar to the small batch approach that you have to software itself. So as management, you want to stage out this change, right? You want to start small with a few initial teams and then grow to other ones. And I think in contrast, again, there's the trainings that happen. There's doing the center of excellence method, where, again, just another way of training things, but you're developing that heightened way of doing things. There's another methodology that it actually gets used in a lot of places, but you have to be careful with the way you do it. And that is to set up an entirely new organization. Often this is called a labs or an innovation center. And it's often a new building physically set aside somewhere that has very well lit. As I always joke, it's got lots of pale wood. It's got that freshness smell to it, lots of open spaces. People are trying to ape the typical Bay Area startup setup. You might even have exposed brick. And this can kind of work if what your notion is that we're setting up those initial teams from our existing organization to work in this environment and kind of work in this building. And if your idea is that this is not a playground for the privileged and a special place where we're doing things, but it's how we're redesigning all of IT. We want to be inclusive of all the people working on our software, not just some select setting that we have. Now, the reason there's a lot going on in this way of doing things, and there should be a name for this methodology, but the reason it works out well, right, is because you do remove people from the existing norms, the existing buildings, existing teams, and you allow them to not get infected, so to speak, by the existing way of doing things. And you're setting up more of, as we used to call it, a skunk works for these initial teams to start doing things in a new way. But again, what's very important is that you're not creating an other. And what's important is that you're creating a new place that you're moving all of the existing software people over to. And you want it to be a place that people can voluntarily go to if needed, not just some special place. Because instead, what I see happening, I remember, it's often with the mobile apps, right? When you talk with people about changing the way that they do software across their organization, taking this more product mentality for software, there's often always a team somewhere that's working on a mobile app, or they might be working on some experimental app. And people will use language like this. They get to do whatever. They don't have to follow our norms or do things like that. And what you do is you set up this rivalry between your existing portfolio of software and people, the ones who are currently making all the money and have all the mission critical stuff, where you'll maximize the amount of value and just, goodness that you're going to get by changing that over your legacy organization, the organization that makes all the money. You're really setting them up to not like this new way of doing things and see it as something privileged and really be oppositional towards it. And you're just setting yourself up to have like years-long battles about things. And then also the people in the new thing, they rarely have anything just good to say about people in the older organization. And they definitely or not want to go into that larger organization or the older organization, or feel like people in the old organization from their perspective are messing with them. So you've already set up a very oppositional thing, probably presently and definitely in the future, and you're going to have a lot of difficulty changing your organization over as a whole. But it is good to think about how you're slowly transitioning that. And you may not even think of it as transitioning as how you are changing or transforming your existing organization. Now, there's a bit of contradictory stuff that we'll get to there. But I would have that mindset that we're not creating a new organization that we're going to be oppositional to. We're transforming our existing organization. And whether it's actually in a new building or follows norms or whatever, the point is that we don't have an old organization. We just have teams and applications that haven't switched over yet and are in the process of getting their way to all of that pale wood desk and things like that. So the next thing is, when you have these initial teams, is the seeding practice. And I was just talking with one of the interviews I have is with Richard Watson, who used to work at Gartner. He works with us now. And he mentioned this very common practice that in order to scale up or spread this new way of doing software to other teams, it's important to take people, to maybe one or two people from these small teams you initially had, and start to seed them into other teams. They become the sort of, there should be some snappy word for them, but they're people who have operated in this new way. They have credibility in operating in this new way because they've actually worked on products at the organization. They've worked on whether it's banking products or retail things or whatever. So they help new teams bootstrap into doing things in a new way. They bring a knowledge of the new operating principles, for example, of how to do pairing, how to do test-driven development, how to convert your stuff to a containerized way of doing things and make it so it runs on Kubernetes, how to do your all your shift left stuff of making it secure. Obviously, one person isn't going to know all of that, but they help seed that knowledge into the team to make bootstrapping, as it were, easier for the people who are transforming the way that they do their work. Now, to give you a little commercial break, that's part of what we also provide in Tanzu Labs is we have people who are used to this new way of working and experienced, and they often seed initial teams to bring in that experience and create your own, let's call these people seeds. I think I went over this a little bit with the outsourcing stuff a while ago. But you want to, as you're scaling to all of these new application teams, you want to find at least one person, if not a couple people, who have experience doing this and who can not only do the work, but also train other people to do it. This is especially vital for a lot of the product-centric practices you're going to do, like product management and design. It's really good to have someone who's got experience doing it. And I think it's really good to have someone who is an employee staff at your organization rather than only, for example, people from Tanzu Labs. But you want to start getting a lot of people who are existing staff, because I feel like their coworkers, the other people in your organization, are going to trust them a lot more than they're going to trust outsiders like us even. So they come with that credibility built in there. So you can see if you start to do the seeding and you're always, as management, you're grooming and finding these people who can be seeds, who are always interested in doing new things and are used to working with others, who are, I wouldn't say people centric, but they don't mind, I don't know, what are some easy tricks? They don't mind like giving a presentation, or they might be good at documenting things. And they definitely are interested in working with new people, and they're outgoing. So identify those people and use them as seeds to, over the first year or so, at least work on initial projects and maybe go work on at least one other project. And I think the similar thing when you're thinking about security people and operations people, even your governance people, depending on how much of a feature that is. Find other people like that who can seed, they can shift left their perspectives and seed in the team as well. So always be identifying those people that you can use as seeds. Now, the third thing that people do very frequently is, and this is where the contradictory thing comes from me talking about not setting up an existing organization, but very frequently, I see people set up, what would you call it? They set up a brand and an ethos around their new way of doing things. And there's a couple of things here. One is you've got to be careful about using an outside label for what you're doing. So again, what you're doing is you're changing your traditional way of doing software, your project-driven way of doing software, or waterfall, as we used to call it, over to this product way where you're doing product stuff. I won't go over it here. Lots of other talks about what that means. And you can read my books if you go to tanzutalk.com, or if you go to tanzutalk.com, you can find links to download the books where I discuss a lot what that is, or just go through the archives, which you can also find at tanzutalk.com. But what they do, what people tend to do is avoid just saying we are doing agile, or we are doing lean startup, or we are doing Tanzu Lab style stuff. And the reason you try to avoid doing this is people who are objecting to you, who are objecting to you doing things, will often look at what those codified things are. And one, they can use the basic arguments that you've been hustled by someone and you're just paying to do some other methodology rather than what works better. You're almost locking yourself into an external methodology. So that could be an objection that people have. But then there's also a type of objection that, like, what would you call it? It can be done in a offensive way, offensive as in attacking you. Like you remember my general theory that, like, in a corporate enterprise environment, you're always playing a zero-sum game for resources amongst management peers. So you're always trying to put down other people if you're competing with them for resources and attention, for bonuses, for raises, prestige, all of that stuff. There's a limited amount of that to go around, so you're in a zero-sum game with them. I don't know if I'm using that term correctly, but whatever. So people might also criticize what you're doing because you're not following to the letter what those processes are. And you would see this a lot with Scrum. As organizations would adapt the way that Scrum was used, the first criticism is always, oh, they don't really do Scrum because they sit down for their stand-up meeting. And not. But what's important is not that you follow all of the orthodoxy, the exact prescripts of these industry standard ways of doing things. Your lean product management as a whole, XP, Scrum, whatever DevOps methodologies are. You can never really pin down DevOps methodologies by design, but what's important is that you figure out what works in your organization, how you've adapted it. And also that it fits to the platforms that you're building, commonly a container-based platform like the Tanzu application service or things like that, whatever. And so what I see organizations doing is they come up with their own brand for that methodology, right? So you look at someone like BT and they call what they do Canvas. And in Duke Energy, one of the examples that I used in a previous book, they have a booklet, which I'm always forgetting to show, that kind of codifies the way that they do things. And I think in the US Air Force, there's a lot of naming around the projects that they do, the Kessel Run. So you see this branding, but also this documentation of the process, right? Here's the process that we follow. We have adapted these external processes and we're showing and naming them as how we do things. So think about how you're branding that as much as possible. And I think most recently, the presentations by BT from the Spring One platforms last year, you really see this come out in the keynote that they did and some of the other sessions where they talk about Canvas as the brand that they have. So the third part of that, when you come up with this brand, is you should dedicate at least one person full-time to be, we don't really say evangelist anymore, but the advocate, the marketer, if you will, for that platform. Now, this should be someone who is also outgoing, right? Who is technical and has a kind of program management thing related to them. So what this person is going to do, and again, BT is a good example. I did this with them when their initial runs, and they've got at least one person dedicated to this, last I heard, is they are going team to team, and they can present to a room full of people at a location, and they are going over what your methodology, what your platform is. And they also set up, let's have a half-day workshop with you to go over what the platform is, what the architecture is, and even do a lot of technical demos of what it looks like, and be there to answer questions, right? So it's this platform as a product mentality where you're not prescribing and policing what people are doing, the methodology that they're following, this more product way of doing things. You're not prescribing and policing them doing their enterprise architecture and things like that. But you're helping them. You're treating them like customers. You're marketing to them and not only telling them the platform that you have and the product methodology, but you are doing a lot of marketing to help build trust and train them about using it and answer questions. And then also critically, you're gathering feedback for them. You're advocating not only for the new way of doing things, but you're also advocating for them. You go back to management, to the people running the platform, the people who are codifying your new methodology, and you tell them these are the needs that people have. So those are just at a very high level, a good collection of things to start with when you're thinking about the strategy for scaling this. So again, start small, right? Start with a small group of teams and really pay attention to how you take a stock methodology like the Tanzu Labs methodology, a product methodology, really experiment with it and see what works and doesn't work, and genuinely study and transform, change, and adapt that methodology to work with your organization. And then identify people in those initial teams and spread them out to other teams as you scale out to help have trusted insiders, trusted staff beyond outsiders you might talk with, help do that. And then carefully figure out how you transform your existing organization instead of setting up a new organization. Have branding around that, really try to write down the methodology that you follow. And then also have your sort of internal marketing with at least one person who is an advocate for it and help spread that around. And then finally, I forgot this part, every 3 months, you really do need to set up internal conferences where all of this kind of centralizes. You have these teams present about what they're doing. You have that advocate person or people present what the methodology is and things like that, and start setting up on a quarterly cadence until you figure out otherwise, if less frequently is better or not. But just start on a quarterly basis, having an internal conference at least half a day. I think half a day works especially well nowadays where, everyone's online. But I would advocate a full day if you're going to be doing things in person, just because people will get distracted. But set up that internal conference to start to present about what people are doing and build up your own community around, as BT calls their thing, your canvas culture, right? The new way of doing things. And again, the more that you adapt the way to do things to what fits with you, the more you can talk with yourself rather than having outsiders come in, rather than hoisting some outside way of doing things. You really want to have ownership and have people identify with your new culture. And that over the course of several years, that's how I see a lot of organizations be successful at scaling this culture change we're always talking about to, hundreds of teams, tens of thousands of staff out there. You can find all the archives if you go to tanzutalk.com. And I always appreciate people sharing things here and there. All right. With that, we'll see everyone on Tuesday at 10:30 Europe time, Amsterdam time. Bye-bye.